Hello, my name is Nigel Bajos, and this is my review of the Sony A6000. So before we go any further, I just want to let you guys know that this is a review of the camera from a filmmaking perspective. I'm only going to be talking about the video features of this camera. If you guys want to know about this camera as far as a photography tool, there are plenty of other review videos online. So back in 2014 when this was released, I saw a lot of really good footage from this camera. People like Philip Bloom were using it, and the camera looked really intriguing, but as I started looking into the feature set and the design of the camera, there were a lot of things that it lacked, which really prevented me from buying it. I actually did get a chance to use it this past April on a behind the scenes feature for my buddy Darren's channel called Beyond Slow Motion. We shot fire skateboarding in the rain, so if you guys want to check that out, I'll put the links in the description below. But anyways, let's go into the handling and the ergonomics of this camera. So as far as the handling and the ergonomics of this camera, it actually feels really nice. The grip is, pretty deep, and even though I have, relatively large hands, it doesn't feel awkward when I hold it. It does have a built-in electronic EVF, which is really nice, so you don't need an LCD viewfinder. The electronic viewfinder is actually pretty good. I use it for focusing and exposure, and it works just fine. The record button is one thing that kind of is awkwardly placed, and it's kind of hard to find sometimes, but there is a little piece of kit called the Cine Easy Touch, and it's just a little button enhancer for the record button, which I got. It's only about $15, and it's been working a treat. I really like it. The LCD screen is really nothing to write home about. It's not the sharpest LCD screen I've ever used, but you can still use it for exposure and focus. It's not a fully articulating LCD screen either, so when you're doing sit-down interview stuff like this, when I'm trying to record myself, I can't actually see what I'm recording, which is kind of a bummer. It does tilt a little bit just when you're getting like low angle shots or high angle shots. So that feature is nice, especially when you're doing slider moves. I always, flip the LCD screen so I can see it, so I don't have to get into a really low position to see what I'm filming. So overall, I really do like the way that this camera is designed. It feels really good in the hands, and the only real complaint that I have is that record button, but I fixed it pretty easily with that Cine Easy Touch. All right, so now let's go into the feature set of this camera, and we'll see what the Sony A6000 brings to the table as far as specs. So inside there is a 24.3 megapixel APS-C size sensor, which is equivalent to Super 35, and you can shoot in 24, 30, or 60p in full 1080, and you can also shoot with the XAVCS 50 megabits per second codec, thanks to the update by Sony. Back when it first came out, you could only shoot in AVC HD, which was one of the reasons why it took me such a long time to actually get my hands on this camera, because I do not like shooting in AVC HD. You also get focus peaking and zebras, which are great tools for focus and exposure. This camera has a Sony E mount, so any Sony E mount lens will fit on this camera. And you can also get things like focal reducers or speed boosters to turn this camera into like a mini full frame camera. Another really cool thing about this camera is that there's a feature called clear image zoom, which pretty much it crops the sensor so you get a zoomed in image without degrading the quality too much, which I found is really helpful in run and gun situations when I didn't need just a little bit more reach from my lens. So that's a really cool feature to have. The only thing that this camera lacks that I wish it had was a true flat picture profile. The picture profile that I've been using on this camera is the neutral profile, and I've turned the contrast and the saturation all the way down to -3 with the sharpening at 0. There is a way to get an S-Log-ish picture profile for this camera, and it involves installing the Live View grading app. When you install the Live View grading app on this camera, there is a picture profile called Silky, which resembles like S-Log2, S-Log3. The only caveat with doing this is that when you're using the Live View grading app, it only allows you to shoot in AVC HD, which to me kind of defeats the purpose, so I actually wouldn't recommend even doing that. For me, the neutral profile set at -3 for saturation and contrast does the job just fine. If you really need the extra latitude, then I wouldn't go for this camera. All right, so now let's talk about audio. As far as audio goes, this camera is not going to do you any favors. In fact, it's probably going to cripple you. There is no mic jack on this camera, and the onboard mics are placed at a spot that if you wanted to get something like the Rycote Windjammers to at least put a little, furry windscreen on your onboard mics just so you could, block out some of the wind noise, you can't do that because they're at a certain spot on this camera where it's basically impossible to put anything on top of them without, getting in the way of like the lens mount. So this camera, as far as audio goes, you know, internally isn't that bad. It's usable. If you watch the behind the scenes feature that I shot, it doesn't sound that bad, but still it would be nice to actually have, you know, proper audio options going into this camera. So that is one big downfall with this camera, is that you can't even plug a mic into it. If you're going to be doing audio, it's always better to do separate system sound with this camera. All the mics that are designed for this camera, I've tried all of the mics and they're pretty much all horrible, especially for how much they cost. I wouldn't recommend any of them, and that is one of the biggest downfalls of this camera. I don't understand why Sony doesn't put mic jacks in their camera, especially like the Sony A6000. That one has a mic jack. Why can't the A6000 have one? Again, I'll go into my solutions for audio with this camera in a different video. If you wanted to know anything about this camera, that is the biggest downfall, it would be that there is no mic jack, and the onboard mics that are placed on this camera have just horrible placement. It's nice that they're in front, but it just sucks where they are because you can't, you know, do any kind of modifications to block out the wind noise. But yeah, for me, audio in this camera was a really big disappointment. So let's talk about codecs real quick. The Sony A6000 shoots in AVC HD or XAVCS. There's also a lower quality MP4 format, which I would never recommend using. The XAVCS codec is actually a newer feature that they released in a firmware update. Before that firmware update, you could only shoot in AVC HD, which is one of the things that I really didn't like because I do not like AVC HD. The XAVCS codec is pretty nice. It records at 50 megabits per second, which I think is the broadcast standard data rate. The only thing with that codec is that you do have to get faster cards. Luckily, cards are going down in price so quickly. I got a 90 megabit per second PNY card for like $17 or something like that on Amazon. So they're not really that expensive, which is nice. If you do want to shoot in XAVCS, you do need a faster card. Okay, so real quickly, let's talk about ISO and low light performance. This camera does have an APS-C size sensor, so it's pretty big, a lot bigger than my Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera's sensor. And so it's actually pretty good in low light. I found the ISO to be usable at about 1600, which is pretty good. A lot better than the Canon EOS M. I think you could maybe get clean images with like 800 ISO. The low light is very nice on this camera. Granted, you have a fast lens. Obviously, it's not going to be as good as like the Sony A7S. For, you know, a camera that costs about $500, this actually produces some pretty good images in low light situations. So let's talk about image quality real quick, and I think that this is where this camera really shines, especially for its price point. You can get this camera for about $400 to $500 right now for just the body, and the prices are only going to drop and drop as new Sony cameras come out. But the image quality looks really, really nice. It's got a really clean looking image. I actually prefer the image from this camera more so than from my Panasonic GH3, and I loved that camera. Like that was one of my favorite cameras that I've owned. But I actually like the image from this camera a little bit better. Another nice thing is that it gives you about the equivalent detail and sharpness as a Panasonic GH3, but it has a bigger sensor. If you got a Panasonic GH3, you could always put a speed booster on it and get a, you know, Super 35 APS-C equivalent field of view. But with this one, you already have that same kind of quality, and you already have the sensor that is Super 35 millimeter equivalent. Yeah, obviously there's a bunch of things that the Panasonic cameras have that the Sony cameras don't, like better codecs, headphone jacks, mic jacks, all that kind of stuff. But as far as just the image, I definitely prefer the image on the Sony A6000 more so than the GH3. I've never been a Sony fanboy. In fact, this is my first Sony camera since I was like 13. I had like a Sony Handycam back then. I've shied away from Sony for the longest time just because I hated the way that Sony, you know, reproduced colors, and I hated their codecs that they put in their you know, more affordable cameras. But I like the image from the Sony A6000. I think it looks really nice. So now let's talk about battery life. And this is something that a lot of people online are really upset about, is that the batteries on the Sony smaller cameras just do not last very long. And I can agree, they don't last, they're not great. Definitely not as good as like the Panasonic GH3 and GH4. Like those batteries last forever, it seems. The Sony A6000, you can get about 45 minutes to an hour on one battery, which doesn't sound that good, but from my perspective, I just had a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, and that battery lasted 15 to 20 minutes. That one sucked. Like, so coming from a camera like that to a camera that lasts 45 minutes to an hour, that is perfectly sufficient for me. I bought 2 extra third-party batteries and I've been satisfied. Switching the batteries isn't really that big of a deal, and 45 minutes to an hour is a perfectly acceptable runtime in my opinion. So let's talk about rigging. I probably do an entire rig video for this camera a little bit later on, but personally, right now, I don't have it rigged out at all. It's just the camera on a tripod. The only real accessories that I've, put onto this camera was that Cine Touch, just so that the record button was a little bit easier to find when I was holding it. This camera feels really good in the hands though, like straight out of the box. You don't need a rig for it. There are some applications like filming skateboarding where I would like to have an actual cage on it with a top handle, so I can, get lower shots. But as far as just needing a rig, like the Blackmagic Pocket, I believe that you really need a rig to do anything, especially if you want to film longer than 15 minutes at a time. Putting a rig on that, having a battery pack with your mic, I think that all stuff was, very necessary for that camera. With this camera, it's got a large sensor, so you don't really need a speed booster. It's got, decent battery life. It's not the best. It's got good enough battery life where, you can put one battery in, take 2 extras, and you can probably film for the entire day. You don't need an external battery source. So rigging for this camera is not necessary, but having said that, I probably will be putting out a rig video later on in the future. So in conclusion, if you're looking for a small, affordable camera with a large sensor, pretty good in low light, really nice image quality with a pretty decent codec, and the Sony A6000 is definitely a good option. There are a lot of downfalls to this camera, and there are a lot of other cameras in the same price range that don't have as many of the flaws that this camera does. But no matter what camera you get, it's always going to have its own handicaps. But overall, I really like the size of this camera, and I like the price, and I like the image that it produces. Everything that's wrong about it can be fixed or tweaked or worked around, in my opinion. And really it just comes down to what kind of films are you trying to make and what are you really looking for in a camera. If you need a camera that has really long battery life and has all of the audio options that you could possibly want, is definitely not the camera for you. If you're on a budget and you're just looking for a camera that produces a really good image and you can deal with the audio side separately, this is a really good option. It produces a really nice 1080p image. In fact, I'll leave a link in the description to Philip Bloom's short blog post about this camera, and I really agree with him on a lot of the things that he says about this camera, but when he had it, AVC HD was the only thing that was available. I would definitely recommend this camera over something like the EOS M. The only time where I would say the EOS M has advantage over this camera is the fact that you can install picture profiles to the EOS M. There's a bunch of them out there now. Andrew Reed from EOS HD just released a C-Log picture profile, so you can install that, Vision Color, CineStyle, and that's really nice to have a flat picture profile in your camera. That's something that the EOS M can do that this can't do, and the EOS M also has a mic jack, which this camera does not. But the image on this Sony A6000 is superior to the Canon EOS M, and it's only a little bit more expensive. So if you're looking for image quality over audio options and flat image profile, then I would definitely go for the Sony A6000 over that camera. But yeah, that was my review of the Sony A6000. If you've made it to this point, then I respect that. It's kind of a longer video than I usually do, but I just wanted to try to cover as many of the bases of this camera as I possibly could. If you guys enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and if you want to see more content like this, subscribe to my channel. But yeah, until next time, I will see you guys later. Peace.